It is time for us to take this nut off. So the first thing we do to get the nut off is we loosen all the strings. And we just want these bad boys out of our way. So the easiest way to do this is to take your bridge down, making sure that the tailpiece doesn't drop and scratch the top. And we're just going to take these out of the tailpiece. We're going to take the tailpiece completely off. And then if I was saving these strings, I would just wrap these up around once and take the strings through and then just put them over top of the pegs, over top of a peg and maybe a scroll, just to keep them out of the way. But since this particular instrument is going to lose these strings, then I'm not afraid at all to just break all these pegs loose and kind of pull on them a little bit until I get all of these off. Now, I could take all the pegs out, but I'm going to just push these in to make sure that they don't go shooting off on me while I do the rest of this work. I'm going to want a mallet for this. The mallets come in several different forms. They come in a canvas mallet like this, where the head itself is actually made out of canvas. They come in Delrin, which is this is actually just a really hard plastic, or they come in rawhide. Now, if you're at a school, oftentimes the mallet used for chimes will be a rawhide mallet. So just go over to your band director and borrow a rawhide mallet. If he thinks you're going to do any damage to it, you're not. I've used this one in my shop for over 20 years and it's still looking just like a mallet. It's no big deal. What I want to try for the very first shot is to see if I can just get the glue to break and snap off of here. If this is glued on correctly, it's glued on with hide glue, and hide glue will break loose. So what we can do is we can actually come in on this side of, or on a side of the nut and try to pop the nut loose. I'm going to use, this is just a big piece of plastic, dowel rod would work as well. I'm going to put this up against just the nut. Now notice how this is just against the nut. I'm going to make sure I'm not up against the body of it. I want to go in there. This one actually has a little bit of a notch cut into it. So I'm actually going to just place that notch right there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit this with my hammer and try to move this a little bit. If this is white glue, or hide glued on, it should pop off fairly easily. So I give that guy 3 solid strokes and it's not moving. So I'm going to go to another step. And I'm going to grab my seam separation knife. Now these come in several forms, but this guy is a really narrow edged, and you can see how it's skinny up here and fatter down here. And that's in order to, when I get it in someplace, as I keep pushing in, it's going to act like a wedge and just kind of push stuff apart. So I'm going to come in right here at the top of this neck. I'm going to push this in on that nut. And I'm making sure I'm not diving down into the maple here. I'm really making sure I'm right in that slot between the nut and the board. And I'm going to push this guy in a couple different ways and times. I may even try coming in on the top and putting some pressure on it, trying to crack this glue loose. Feel free to come around the corners. There, I got some good movement in it. You can see in this shot how far in underneath the nut I actually am with the separation knife. This tells me that we do have hide glue and it's not white glued on. If it was white glued on, I wouldn't be getting in this far this easily. And now I'm going to just slide that in there a little bit more. That sounds a good sound. That's the hide glue itself cracking off. Now, I know I've got some separation in underneath there. I want to separate the nut from the fingerboard. So I'm actually going to come in from the top as well. Try to put some pressure in on that. I'm going to use my whacker bar. I'm going to come back down on this nut. Now you notice my left hand, I'm right over top of the neck here. I'm over top of the mortise. I don't want to be off over top of here because that could pull my fingerboard off. So I'm right over top of the mortise, bringing that whacker bar in. And I just chipped the nut. So we're going to put a new one on. Let's see what happens if we come in this way. Well, on this one we're actually going to get the entire fingerboard off before we get the nut apart, it looks like. There we go. Now we got into it. Finally got that separation where the nut came off. I've got a little bit of a separation underneath the fingerboard. See how the knife goes in underneath the fingerboard? So I'm going to want to make sure I put some glue on that and clamp that down while I'm doing the work on my nut. So this nut has a bunch of glue on it that we need to get off of it. Remember, glue does not stick to glue. So if I've got my nut off, or it has come off and I need to get it on there, first thing is I've got to get it cleaned. So I'm going to use just a flat rasp file or a bastard file. Don't ask me why they're called bastard files, I don't know. I didn't name it. But rasp file seems to be the more modern name that we're starting to see show up everywhere. So I'm just going to take a couple strikes on that, and you can see how I've got it a lot cleaner, but I'm still not there. So I'm going to just shift my hand position over top of it. I was on the sides. I'm going to go in the middle just to make sure I'm keeping the nut flat against the file. And that's looking not bad. So you can actually see that this is free of glue now. I don't have any of the crystal glue. That crystal glue looks like this. But what you can see is that this nut is not perfectly flat. So when it was manufactured, it has all sorts of gouges and lines in it. And we need to decide whether we're going to allow that or not. The considerations I have on trying to decide if I take that material off the bottom is, do I have enough distance from the top of the nut down to the fingerboard? And on this one it was already fairly close, and the instrument itself isn't that high quality. So I'm not, to be perfectly honest, I'm not overly concerned about having this be absolutely pristine and beautiful. Obviously the manufacturer wasn't worried about that either. So on this one I think I'm just going to take the glue off and stick it back on there. If I'm dealing with a very high-end violin, then I'm probably, to be honest with you, knowing that this was already short, probably going to just make a new nut. So now I've done the bottom, now I'm going to do this side where the fingerboard comes up against. Same thing on the fingerboard side. You can see just how rough that is. So I don't know what kind of rasp file they were using to smooth that out, but boy, that's bumpy. I'm not a huge fan. Sometimes the rasp itself will actually fill up with material. Flip it over and try a different side. Okay, so on this nut, I've got all of the glue taken off of it on both sides, and I'm probably going to be okay with it. I'm not overly worried about the bumps on it. I'm going to glue this bad boy back on and move on with life. Let's say you were a bonehead like me, and when you were taking the nut off, you chipped it. Do you see this little chip piece here, and how there's a chip out of it right there? I'm not overly concerned about that, because I can fix a lot of that. The string is going to lay down inside of this notch, and I only want between 1/4 and 1/2 of the string to be down inside of that notch. I do not want half of the string in there, otherwise the nut itself sucks up the vibration of the string. And so this is the E string side, no, this is the G string side on this violin, this is the E string side. That A slot's really wide. The G slot's actually not very wide. So I'm going to show you how I would fix this. I'm going to go back to my rasp, and I'm going to come across the nut this direction. So here's my string notches on this. I'm going to come across the nut this way and in that arc. So I'm going to try to maintain the curvature on this. I'm not going to just file right straight across it. I'm going to always be curving around this. And files, remember, they only cut one direction. So this file is going to cut in this direction. Normally wherever the handle is, it's pushing from that handle is the direction it's going to cut. When I'm pulling backwards, I'm just burnishing it or making it smoother. And right now, I want this file to be cutting, so I'm going all in one direction. Remember, the nut is also curved this direction, so as I'm going, I want to roll my file back and forth this direction as well. The good news is, if you get it on your skin, skin's amazing. It's pretty tough. You're not going to lose any skin. I don't know why. I really can't explain to you why. I'm sure if you sat here and did this long enough, you burn a hole in your finger. But it'll take a lot of material off the wood really fast. Skin is just amazing, so don't be afraid if it's hitting your fingers. You're not going to get burned or scraped like it was sandpaper. Now, I'm also going to come in here and smooth this back out this direction, making sure I don't leave any lines in that nut. Now what we've got is those notches, those chips are gone. But you'll also notice that we've filed through the majority of our string slot. Now, the back sides are still there. I just want to reinstate the string slot at the front. I'm going to use these files from Stuart McDonald. These come in measurements. So this is a 0.024 of an inch, and they have a packet of several more of them. I like these. You've got a round file in yours, so it'll be a really skinny round file in your kit. That's what I want you to use on this. And in here, I'm just going to come in on that slot and really slow, really careful. I'm going to push this forward and I'm going to reestablish that string slot. I do not need to sit here and saw this down a lot. I need about 5 or 6 strokes in here to reestablish that slot. That'll do us. Now on this G string, since I'm not thrilled with that, I'm going to go into a slightly larger file and open this up. You would just use the slightly fatter part of the round file that we sent you. And that's it. Now this nut is ready to be glued back on. The next thing we need to do is we need to prepare this surface here. We've got 2 different surfaces. You've got the surface of the back of the fingerboard and the maple itself. You can see on this one how we've got a little bit of wood left over. That may explain a little bit of the bumpiness on the bottom, is that we actually tore some of this off. And if we're lucky, that should fit. We're not lucky. Sometimes it'll fit like a little Lego piece and stick itself back in there. We're not that lucky on this one, so we are just going to go back to a rasp and remove that material. Now, rasps come in 2 different forms. This rasp has cutting surface on 1, 2, 3, and 4 sides. This rasp, which is the rasp we recommend you buy in the kit, has cutting surfaces on 1, 2, 3 sides, but this side is still smooth. Now, I like this because when I go to file on the fingerboard and I've got this down, I don't want to be cutting a notch into the maple neck. I want to just keep that fairly flat. So I'm going to start off with the cutting side. Remember, this side does not have teeth, but this side does. And I'm going to start off with that one here on this nut. And I'm using my thumb. I've got a hold of the instrument. I'm using my thumb to push this forward and backward, up and down the neck like this. If you want to be extra special careful, you can grab yourself a piece of blue tape and put that blue tape right at the edge like that, so you don't ever run into the varnish of the instrument itself. This one is a little bit fatter, so I'm just going to use it, and more aggressive. you can see that all of the black is gone and we've got that cleaned up. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the smooth surface, the non-filed side, the smooth surface, down against that in order to file off the glue that's on the edge of the fingerboard. There we go. Now the crystal glue is all gone, and now we can set this nut right back in that spot. Now if you remember, I separated this fingerboard a little bit as I was taking the nut off because it didn't just pop off. So I'm going to glue up inside of there and glue this all at one point. I'm going to leave this piece of tape on here to where if I get any glue that sneaks out of there, I'm reducing the amount of cleanup that I need to do. But I am going to eventually, after I get the glue, I'm going to take this piece off before I lay my tape on. That's going to be the final piece of tape that I put on here. You're going to need a clamp for this part where we're clamping down on the fingerboard. And this is a really cheap clamp from Harbor Freight. They work great. This is a quick grip clamp and they work pretty good for this. I'm going to use this Harbor Freight one. I like these because they have a plastic cap here. I get rid of the cap that they have on the metal and I actually just glue some cork on there so I know I'm not going to cause any damage. And I'm going to come in here and I'm going to size this up before I even get busy with the glue. I try to back this off all the way so this is tight up against here because I know I'm going to get tighter and I want to have plenty of room to do that. And then just push these guys here and it releases the mechanism so it slides up and down on here. When you let go, it locks into place. So I'm going to put this guy down about like that so I know that I can get that on there and put the pressure on. And I'm going to do this in 2 steps. I'm going to take my high glue, going to have 2 sections of paper towel that I've just cut up. I'm going to get one of these wet. It's wet, it's not soaking wet, but I've got plenty of water in that. And this one I'm going to leave perfectly dry. I'm going to start by gluing this fingerboard on first, and then we're going to move on from there. So I'm going to take my glue and I'm just going to use straight from the bottle. I'm going to put some up in there. And you notice how some just squirted off over the side and some's dripping in here. I'm not worried about that. I'm going to use my finger and just press down inside of that. And what I'm doing is I'm creating a little bit of hydraulic pressure to push this glue back in that corner. I'm going to use that piece that I dripped off there. I'm going to come over here on the sides. And I'm just forcing that glue into that crack there. Now, I'm going to use this wet towel. And I'm just going to come in here and wipe up all of the spots that may have glue, including my thumb marks that I'm putting on over here. I'm going to come right into that nut. I'm going to clean all of this off. High glue is water soluble, and so it'll get soaked up into this cloth. Then I'm going to take my dry towel. I'm just going to come in and dry all of this area up. Clean up my bench too while that stuff is still wet. And then I'm going to come in here with my clamp, and I'm going to put this clamp on. I'm going to slide this clamp up in here. And I'm going to put just a little bit of pressure on this. Now if we're lucky, ooh, do you see it right here? You see how some of that glue is squishing out? I'm actually going to slide this up just a little bit more. When we put that down, we get a little bit of squeeze out, and that's what we want. That means I got plenty of glue up inside there, so much so that when we put pressure on it, some's coming out. So I go back to my wet rag, and I just clean that up. Same thing, go back with the dry. And get all of that cleaned up. I'm going to dry that peg off, just make sure I don't have any glue in the water that got stuck in there. Now I'm going to let that set, and I'm going to let that set up for about 30 minutes before I take the clamp off and put the nut on, because I'm going to change the clamping pressure in both areas as soon as I go to put that nut on. After about 30 minutes, this should be dried out and tacky enough that it's going to hold. But I'm going to want to put some pressure back on it after I get the nut taped on in place. And I'll show you how that works here in just a minute. Okay, so we've got that fingerboard has set up enough to where I can take that clamp off and put the nut on, and then I'm going to reset that back up. Normally, you're not going to have that fingerboard problem to fix, but I'm just showing you just in case it is an issue. It's something for you to take a look at to see if that fingerboard has come up off the top of that neck just a little bit, so you can glue that in. But this one's set up enough to where I'm not worried about it, and it's time to glue this nut back in place. So I've got this off. I've got my nut cleaned up and ready to go. I've got the notch taken out of it. I've got the little chip taken out of it. I've got my string slots carved back into it. I am ready for this guy to go back on here. And this is ridiculously simple. I'm going to come back into my high glue. I'm going to come in here, and mind you, I've got my wet towel and I've got my dry towel at the ready. I've got my glue, and I've also got blue tape all at the ready. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to be careful, and I just want a dab of glue on there. You can see how small that dab is. It is not very much at all. And then I can use my finger, or I can use a screwdriver, or I can use whatever you feel comfortable with. I'm just going to move that glue around. I'm going to make sure this sums up on that fingerboard. And I don't need a large amount of this glue. So I'm going to take some of that off with my finger. And then I'm simply going to place my nut in there. And I'm going to put some pressure on it from right here. I'm pushing into the fingerboard and I'm pushing down with my thumb and index finger. I'm going to just come in here and clean any of that up before I cover this up with tape. I'm going to come in here with my dry towel. See how that's moving? That's fine. Not worried about it. I have just a little bit of glue shooting out on the top here. So I want to get as much of the cleanup done because I'm going to put this tape on, and any of that squeeze out that would happen, I want to be able to get to it. As soon as I put the tape on, I'm not going to be able to get to that very well. So I'm taking my time, really pushing this in, and then really drying this off so the tape will hold. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a piece of this blue tape. I'm going to peel myself off a section that's just a couple inches long. I'm going to grab a hold of it on both ends. And I'm going to start in the middle. I want to make sure I grab that nut and I'm pulling on it pretty good. Now I'm going to just stick it here on the sides of the neck. I'm going to come in here and check to make sure that that nut is where I want it, side to side, and being pulled forward. Don't be afraid to put a little bit of pull on that. You're going to find, probably the first time you do it, you'll probably tear the tape. But don't be afraid to pull on that just a little bit and get that going. You'll find that there's this good pull in here. I'm just going to tape that down. Now with that on, now I can come back in with my clamp and I can reset up this top-down pressure. I'm making sure though that this clamp's not on the nut, and it's just on the fingerboard. Now I've got this all set in place, and I can let that set for about an hour, hour and a half before I take this, the tape off or the clamp off to make sure that that is set in really nice and solid. If you're in a pinch, I want to talk about the other thing you can do. If you're in a pinch, that nut is held on there mostly by string tension. So if you find it's 5 minutes before a concert and the nut has fallen off and you're going, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? I don't have time to do all this work. You don't need to. You can just slide that nut back in underneath there. Even with the crustly glue on, if it's 5 minutes before the concert, it's best if you can knock some of that glue off. But if it's not, fine, just get it in underneath there and add string tension back onto the instrument. The string tension itself will help hold that nut in place. Same thing if you don't have tape or the clamps that you don't feel like it's just moving around on you too much, put the glue on there and then add the strings back on and let the strings be the tension that's on there. The only thing I'm worried about on that is making sure you've got this fingerboard that comes down and you've got the neck that comes out. Making sure the nut sits in there nice and square is great. If it wobbles at all, you're probably going to want to do some work with a file, and we show you how to do all that in the advanced course. There's actually a section on nuts or nut fitting. So we show you how to actually carve the fingerboard, the nut, the neck, all that sort of stuff to make sure that those fit in just like a Lego piece, just perfectly fit, which is what you really want. In a pinch, if you don't have that, I tell you what, slap that bad boy in there and try to get some string tension on it and live with what you got. If you're using hide glue, then it's pretty easy to hit with a hammer and knock back off there, or use a seam separation knife to get it back off there. So get it on there if you really need to. When you finally have everything glued and set up, we can take this clamp off and then simply peel the tape back. And then what we want to do is we want to check and make sure that both sides of the nut, like on both sides here, are where we want it to be, that things didn't shift. If it did shift, and it does happen, if it shifted, then we need to remove the nut again and redo it. This one is fitting nicely. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to inspect the nut real nice and tight and close to see if there's any glue sticking out here or up in here. This one has just a little bit of glue right in this crease here. So I'm just going to come in with a scraper or a metal ruler. So if you had your metal ruler, you could do that. I'm just going to clean that glue up just a little bit in there. Does not take much to pop that off. I'm going to look at the sides here. And because we did all of the cleanup beforehand, there's hardly any work to do now. If you hadn't done any of that cleanup, there would have been little splashes of glue all over the place that you would have to go in and kind of scrape and pop off. It's not overly hard to do, but you run a very real risk of damaging the varnish when you do. So if you can, get as much of that cleanup done beforehand rather than waiting until afterwards. And that's it. You got it up, it's running, it's working great. If you have any questions on this procedure, on this video, or on this topic at all, feel free to ask me. But really, putting nuts back on is not that big of a deal.